Hey everyone, Justin Guiel. It's August 2nd, 2020. So I chose cases 2 and 4. So we all know the questions for the cases, so I'll just get into my answer. So in case 2, the mechanism and regulation for the uptake of glucose depends on the type of tissue. First, tissue, liver, notably the most important for regulating blood glucose levels. They have a GLUT2 receptor on the membrane of the cell surface. These are insulin independent, so they are always on the surface of the cells. So concentrations of insulin do not affect the glucose uptake. In contrast, striated muscles, so skeletal and cardiac and adipose tissue have GLUT4 receptor. They aren't always present in the cell membrane. They are insulin dependent. So in the presence of insulin, they translocate from inside the cell to the membrane surface. After you eat, you make a lot of insulin and it wants to use that glucose. And in skeletal muscle, GLUT4 also translocates during muscle contraction in the presence of the ions to meet the energy requirements of muscle contraction and exercise. While adipose tissue's main function is just the uptake and storage of glucose as triacylglycerols, so fat. The neurons of the brain, however, they require a higher level of glucose. The brain's always functioning and it only uses glucose. So because glucose is the only fuel that generates ATP in these cells, they accommodate this high glucose requirement with GLUT3 receptors. GLUT3 transporters have a higher affinity for glucose in order to keep up with that energy demand. So it's always grabbing onto glucose, always producing ATP in the neurons. So that high energy requirement needs the stronger transporter. So in the video, the PET scan shows the radio-labeled glucose being used by the brain tissue. And in a normal scan, you would probably just see the same haze across the whole thing, but clearly something is using a lot more glucose, has a lot more glucose. So the orange regions show, and the white regions show the area where there's a higher uptake of glucose, which indicates a cancerous tumor. The invasive tumor is made of brain tissue, so it also has a high demand for glucose in order to generate the ATP, and it also uses GLUT3 receptors. This allows the tumor to proliferate and metastasize. I wrote a twisted survival of the fittest, where the body's kind of the ecosystem. So cancerous cells are results of the mutations that give them an advantage over the surrounding neurons that won't perform as well. And the cancer cells also have a mutation usually to avoid programmed cell death. The cancerous brain tissue is using much more glucose than the surrounding tissue, which could be explained by either an upregulation of the GLUT3 receptors coming to the cell surface or being on the cell surface, or maybe an increased affinity for glucose on the GLUT3 receptors. There's a lot of reading, I couldn't tell, but those are my 2 ideas for how cancer cells could use more glucose. I don't know how my time is doing. So the next case I chose is case number 4. Again, you can read the question, we all know the questions. So my first clue to what the issue is causing these symptoms is hypoglycemia. That's kind of a broad problem, but it's a big indicator of what might be going on. So something's obviously wrong with the metabolism, especially in regards to glucose. The mother states that the child sleeps more than 2 hours in the fasted state, specifically like 2 hours after feeding, indicating the inability to regulate blood glucose levels during the fast. So that's where my big idea is, where to do research and where to look in pathways to see what's wrong. The next clue I see is the response to epinephrine. This was the big, more specific clue to help me narrow it down. So it normally activates gluconeogenesis and glycogenolysis. The results showed that there was no increase in blood glucose after administering epinephrine, but there was an increase in lactate, which could be used in gluconeogenesis by the liver in the Cori cycle, but it's clearly not being used because there's a buildup. The fact that there was no regulation of the blood glucose level indicates a deficiency in enzymes somewhere along the gluconeogenesis or glycogenolysis pathway. Examining the girl down here showed an enlarged liver, big clue, or hepatomegaly. This combined with the lack of blood glucose response to epinephrine made me think that glycogen is accumulating in the liver. And it's not being broken down by glycogenolysis. So there is a block in the glycogenolytic pathway, if that's a word. An enzyme that catalyzes both gluconeogenesis and glycogenolysis is glucose 6-phosphatase. A deficiency in this enzyme would show inhibition in both pathways. So I think that's the best idea. And a deficiency in that enzyme is von Gueric's disease or glycogen storage disease 1. So I think it's von Gueric's. This would explain the many symptoms. The lack of glycogenolysis to maintain glucose levels during fasts, which causes crashes. Glycogen accumulation in the liver causing hepatomegaly. Increased lactate after epinephrine caused by inhibition of gluconeogenesis. No increase of glucose after administering epinephrine. So von Gueric's would kind of explain all of those symptoms. You could check for, if you wanted to continue to be sure it's von Gueric's, you can check for hyperlipidemia and hypouricemia to confirm, and then glucose can be given between feedings to help maintain the level in blood. This question had multiple choices, so I picked the GSD, the glycogen storage disorder, but to disprove the others, as the instructions stated, hereditary fructose intolerance would only present symptoms after the child ingested fructose, but she only drinks milk, so that's lactose, glucose, and galactose. There's no fructose. Galactosemia is the inability to convert galactose to glucose. This would present as a fatal crisis, kidney failure, but it wouldn't explain her reaction to epinephrine. G6P dehydrogenase deficiency would present as a disruption in the pentose phosphate pathway. So that explains none of her symptoms either. So the only option was glycogen storage disorder. And that's it.